Hey there! Welcome to the new episode of the Awakening 3D Models series. This is episode 8, and we're gonna learn some really cool stuff today. So, stay with me. In the last episode, we learned about skinning and checked out 2 different ways to do it, but we picked one method that works best for our project and used it to skin our character. Also, we connected the whole character to the rig, except for the springs. And in this episode, we're gonna look at 2 ways to rig those springs. So, stay with me. Sounds fun, right? Let's dive in. Like I mentioned before, there are different ways to rig things, and depending on your project and what you already know, you might choose one method over another. In this episode, we're gonna check out 2 different ways to rig a spring, so you can pick the one that works best for your project. We're gonna use a spline object for both methods. The first method is super simple and fast. Let's jump in. First, hold down Control, and go to the Preferences menu. In the search field, type Extra to make sure Add Curve, Extra Objects is turned on. Now we can close this window. Press Shift-A, go to Curve, then Spirals, and choose Archimedean. Make sure the spiral type is set to Archimedean, and the spiral direction is set to counterclockwise. From this section, we can adjust things like radius growth and the overall radius of the curve. I'm also going to add a bit of height here. Let's set it to 0.5. Then I'll come back here and increase the turns to 10. Set the step to 10 as well. For output curve type, I'm picking Bezier, and I'm setting this last one to auto. All right, I'll just click outside this panel to close it. Let's name this object Spring GEO, and I'll also name the data the same. Okay, now I'll go to the Data tab, and in the Geometry section, I'll give it a bit of depth. Now I press Tab to switch to Object Mode, and here I'll create 3 shape keys. We don't need to touch the basis key. I'll name this one Squash, and set the value to 1. I'll name the next one Stretch, and also set this to 1. Now I press Tab again to go into Edit Mode, and I'll click on the Squash shape key. First, set the Transform Pivot Point to 3D Cursor. I press L to select all the points. Then I'll scale it down along the Z-axis until the spring looks as compressed as I want. I think this looks good for now. Now I'll select the Stretch key and scale it up along the Z-axis until the spring looks stretched enough. Now if we go back to Object Mode and play with these values, you can see the spring compresses and stretches nicely. All right, next we're going to bring in an armature to control this better. Press Shift-A and add an armature. I'll name it Spring Rig and also set the same name for the data. Let's go into Edit Mode, rotate the bone 90 degrees on the Y-axis, and rename this bone to Root. From the Snap menu, I'll choose Vertex. Then I'll press Shift-D to duplicate the bone and hold Control to snap it up along the Z-axis, right to this vertex. And I'll name this one Top. Now I press Control-Tab to switch to Pose Mode, and then hit N to open the Transform panel. I'll right-click on the Z location and choose Copy as New Driver. Now I go to the Data tab for the spring, right-click on the shape key values we created earlier, and choose Paste Driver. This is a super quick way to set up a driver. Next, I move my mouse to the corner here. Click and drag to create a new area. I press Shift F6 twice to switch to the driver editor. On the left side, we can see the squash and stretch values, and in the middle, we see their graph editor view. I'm not going to explain the whole graph editor now. Just know that the horizontal line shows the timeline, and the vertical line shows how things change over time. This diagonal line here is the graph of our drivers, both controlled by the Z location of the top bone. Right now they're stacked on top of each other. Over here, by clicking the eye icons, we can choose which driver to show in the graph editor. First, I select all the key points, press T, and from this menu, I choose Linear, so all points get a linear shape. Now, I'll turn off Stretch and click on Squash. If I click on this keyframe, you'll see 2 values appear on the right. The value is the max amount of squash, and the keyframe shows how far the top bone moves on the Z-axis. Basically, we need to tell Blender how much should the top bone move so that squash reaches 1. If you look here, the top bone needs to move down when squashing. So the number we enter here should be negative. For now, I'll set it to -3. As you can see, the keyframe moved. And now, on this graph, when the top bone moves down to -3, the squash value smoothly goes up to 1. Alright, now let's work on stretch. I'll turn off squash and turn on stretch. I'll click on this keyframe. And since stretch happens when the bone moves up on the Z-axis, I'll set this one to 3. Now I'll turn both drivers on to see what's happening. Based on our setup, when the top bone moves down to -3, squash goes to 1. And when it moves up to +3, stretch goes to 1. Let's test it out. I select the top bone and move it down along the Z-axis. And yeah, it works just like we wanted. Now I'll move it up. You can see the spring stretches and stops right there. But look here, there's a little gap between the bone and the spring. To fix that, I select the spring and change the keyframe values to -2 for squash and 4 for stretch. Now when I move the top bone, everything matches up perfectly. And that's it for the first method of rigging the spring. Alright, let's go for the second method. Just like before, I press Shift-A, go to Curve, Spirals, and choose Archimedean to create a new curve. I press Numpad 1 to go to Front View, and repeat the same settings as before for this one too. Now I go back to Object Mode, and with Shift-A, I add a new armature. I name it Spring Rig, and I give the same name to its data. Then I rename the curve to Spring GEO, and also give it the same name to its data. Next, I select the armature, go to Edit Mode, and rotate the bone 90 degrees, like this. I scale it up just a bit, and name it Root. I set the snap type to Vertex. Then from this point, I press E to extrude, and while holding Control, I move it up on Z until it snaps to this vertex. Now I extrude one more time, like this. I'll name this one Stretch, and the next one Stretch Target. I hold Shift to select these two first, then select Root, press Ctrl P, and choose Keep Offset. Alright, so this one is Root, which we'll use for overall transforms. This bone here will handle the squash and stretch of the spring, and this one will control the direction and the amount of that deformation. Cool, let's go to pose mode. For this bone here, I'll add a constraint called Stretch 2. I pick Spring Rig as the target, and in this field, choose Stretch Target. Now when I move the Stretch Target, you'll see that the middle bone squashes or stretches depending on its position. Next, let's set up the spring. To make it easier to select multiple objects at the same time, I go here and uncheck Lock Object Modes. Now I can select the spring easily. Then I go to the Modifiers tab. And from the Deform section, I add a Hook modifier. I set the object to Spring Rig and choose the stretch bone. If we were using a mesh object, we'd create a vertex group first and assign that group here in the modifier. But since we're using a curve, it's even easier. I just go to Edit Mode, select the vertices I want, and hit Assign in the Hook section. That's it. So I move the mouse over the spring and press L to select all the connected vertices. Then I assign them to the hook. Before we test it, I'll go to the Data tab, and in the Geometry section, I'll add some depth so we can clearly see what's happening. That amount looks good. Back to Object Mode, and now I select the bone. When I move it, boom! The spring is rigged nice and simple. But if you look closely, you'll see that it deforms not just in the Z direction, but also in the other directions. No problem. Just select this bone, go to the stretch constraint, and set this option here to none, and done. Our spring rig is complete. Now we can confidently move on and start rigging Luxo Jr's springs. As you can see, we've got 4 springs, but we only need to rig 2 of them. Then, we can use Mirror to get the other 2. Let me show you how to do it step by step. Let's start with the spring that's placed between the fork block and the sidearm. Here's the thing that makes these springs a bit different from our previous examples. Each of them has two hooks, one on each side, and they're connected to these pins. So let me walk you through how we're going to handle that. First, I'm going to declutter the scene a bit so I can work more easily. Holding Shift, I select the fork block, sidearm, top sidearm, elbow, and the IK controller. I create a temporary collection and assign them all to it. Then I hide the other collections so we can just focus on these. Like I mentioned earlier, a rigging artist should also know a bit of modeling, because sometimes you need to make small adjustments to get things working right. In this case, we need to build the spring manually using a curve object. To save time in this video, I've already prepared these springs, and you'll find them in the practice file for this part. You can download it from ArtStation or Gumroad. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask in our Discord group. The link's in the description, and you'll get your answer as fast as possible. Alright, for rigging these springs, I'm going to use the second method we just learned. First, we need to mark the main points where the bones should be placed. I select the fork block and go into edit mode, then Shift-Alt and click between these vertices to select this loop. I press Shift-S to bring the cursor right here, back to object mode. I press Shift-A to add an empty. Sphere is good, just to mark this point. I scale it down a bit, then head over to the Object tab, and turn on in front to see it better. Okay. I select the spring, and in the Data tab, I temporarily set the depth to 0. While checking that orientation mode is set to global, and snap mode is on vertex, and while holding Control, I move the empty along the x-axis to align it with this hook. Now I repeat the same for the sidearm. I go into its edit mode, use Shift-Alt to select this loop, and move the cursor there. Back in object mode, I duplicate the empty, snap it to the new cursor, and then move it slightly to the right using Control, so it's aligned with the bottom empty. Now we can place the bones. I select the Luxo rig, go into edit mode, press Shift-A to add a new bone, and move it to this point using Control. I select its tail and snap it to this empty. Then I scale the bone down a bit. I change the orientation mode to normal, duplicate the bone, and move it along the y-axis to this vertex, since the squash and stretch starts from here. I also move its tail, snapping it to this vertex, which is the end of the squash and stretch. Then, I duplicate that bone again, and snap it to this empty. I hit Alt-F to flip the bone direction. So basically, these two bones will control both sides of the spring, and the middle one will handle the squash and stretch. We also need another bone at this point, to determine how much squash and stretch should happen. I select this one, and hit E to extrude a bone along the x-axis. Alright, now that all bones are placed, I go to the Data tab, turn on axes, and check their roll values to make sure they're correct. Okay, looks like there's no problem. So, I turn off axes. Let's move on to naming the bones. I'll name this one D spring bottom. The D stands for down. This one, D spring top. This one, D spring stretch. And this one, D spring STT, which stands for stretch target. This one should follow the fork block, so I select it first, then select fork block and press Ctrl P and keep offset. This one should follow the previous one, so I do the same. Ctrl P, keep offset. These two should follow the sidearm, so I select them, then select sidearm and press Ctrl P, keep offset. Now let's go to pose mode to see how everything is coming together. There's a small mistake. Instead of parenting these two to the sidearm, I accidentally parented them to the top sidearm. So I go back to edit mode, select them again, and parent them to the sidearm. Perfect. I go back to pose mode and check it again. It works correctly. To make sure the squash and stretch is applied to the middle bone, I add a stretch to constraint for it. I set the target to Luxo rig and the bone to D spring STT, I also set this one to none. Now if we test it, we see that squash and stretch is working perfectly. Next, let's bind or skin the spring to the rig. I select the spring, going to Edit Mode. In the Modifiers tab, I add a hook modifier under the Deform section. I need 3 hook modifiers, 1 for the middle and 2 for the top and bottom hooks. So, from the same hook modifier, I duplicate 2 more modifiers. I name the first one D-spring top hook, the second one D-spring stretch hook, and the third one D-spring bottom hook. For all of them, I select Luxo Rig as the object. For the bones, I assign the first one to D-spring top, the second one to D-spring stretch, and the third one to D-spring bottom. Okay, very well. I select this vertex, hold Ctrl, and press numpad plus to select these vertices. I assign them to the D-spring top hook. Then I move to the bottom hook. Select the initial vertex. Press numpad plus to select these vertices. And then assign them. There is the select option here, which selects the vertices assigned to the modifier. I select the vertices assigned to both of these modifiers, then move the mouse into the scene, press Ctrl I to invert the selection, and then assign these vertices to the stretch hook. Now, if I move the IK, we see that the squash and stretch is beautifully applied to the spring. I select the spring and give it a bit of depth in the Data tab to better monitor the process. Squash and stretch is working well, but there are some weaknesses at the points related to the hooks. The reason for this is that when the spring moves, both hooks should always be in the same direction, rotating around their pins. It's very simple to fix this. We just need to use a damped track. First, I create a damped track for this one. Set the target to Luxo Rig and select the bone as D-spring bottom. Then I go to the other one and create a damped track for this one as well. Set the object to Luxo Rig and select the bone as D-spring top. Let's test it. These two should not separate from each other. All we need to do is go back to Edit Mode and parent the stretch target to the spring top. Okay, now we see that in any situation, they are aligned in the same direction and rotate around their pins. There's just one more thing left. If I move the IK and press Alt-G to return to the default position, we see that this bone stays in its previous position. I need to press Alt-G again to bring it back to the initial position. To solve this, I just need to go to Edit Mode, duplicate this bone, scale it down, and name it D-spring target. I return to Pose Mode, and in the Constraint tab for this bone, I replace spring bottom with spring target. Since we duplicated this bone, the constraint applied to spring bottom is also on the new bone. So, I'm going to remove this constraint. Congratulations! The first spring of our character is rigged and is reacting exactly how we wanted. Anytime you want, you can go to the Modifier tab of the spring and apply the subdivision modifier from the Generate section to get a smoother shape. Again, from the Generate section, I select Mirror and set the fork block as the reference for this mirror in this field. Very good. We've rigged one spring, but now we have two springs that both behave in the same way. Now let's move to the next spring, which connects the top sidearm to the elbow. I select the top sidearm and go into Edit Mode. I hover over this part and press L to select all the vertices in this area. Then, with Shift S, I bring the cursor here. I select one of the sphere empties that we used earlier and use Shift S to snap it to where the cursor is. Now, I select the elbow, go into Edit Mode, press Shift Alt, and select the loop between these vertices. Then, I bring the cursor here using Shift S. I move the sphere empty I created to this point. Now I go to the Data tab for the spring and set its depth to 0, so I can see the vertices more clearly. I also set the orientation mode to normal, and click the plus to create a new orientation mode based on the spring's normal. Next, I select this empty and move the cursor here. Then I go to Edit mode on the rig and press Shift A to add a new bone. I move this bone along the y-axis so it's placed at this point, where squash and stretch should start. I snap the tail to this empty with Control, but then move it along the y-axis to this point, where the other side of the squash and stretch for the spring is located. I select the bone and press Shift-N to fix its roll. I create a duplicate, scale it down, and snap it to the cursor. Then, I create another duplicate of this, snap it to this empty using Control, and press Alt-F to switch its direction. Next, I create a new bone along the x-axis at this point with E. Great. The bone placement is done. I turn on axes to check the rolls. The roll of this bone isn't in the right direction, so I press Shift-N and select Global Z-axis. Now let's do the naming. With F2, I name this one U-Spring Stretch. This one becomes U-Spring Bottom. This one is U-Spring Top. And this one is U-Spring STT. We forgot one bone. I create a duplicate from this bone, set the pivot to active element, scale it down, and name it U-Spring Target. I parent bottom and target bones. To top sidearm, I parent the stretch bone to the bottom bone. I parent STT to top. I turn on this collection so I can see the top back arm, and then parent top to top back arm. I go to pose mode, and for this bone, I add a stretch to constraint. Set the target to Luxo rig, and the bone to U-Spring STT. I also set this to none, so the squash and stretch happens only along the y-axis. I add a damp track constraint to this bone. Set the target as Luxo rig, bone is U-Spring target. Also for this one, I create another damp track. Target is Luxo rig, and bone is U-Spring top. Now I select the spring, go to the Modifier tab, and add 3 hook modifiers. The first one is U-Spring top hook. The second is U-Spring stretch hook. The third is U-Spring bottom hook. For this one, first I select Luxo rig, then U-Spring top. For this one, first Luxo rig, then U-Spring stretch. And for this, Luxo rig, then U-Spring bottom. I go to edit mode. Select these vertices and assign them to the top. Then I go to this next side. Select these vertices and assign them to the bottom. Now I select both sets. Press Ctrl I to invert the selection and assign those to stretch. I go to the Data tab and give it a little depth so I can double check everything more precisely. Everything looks good? Awesome. Now I can go to the Modifier tab of the spring and add a subdivision modifier from the Generate section. Also add a mirror modifier. And here, I choose top back arm as the mirror reference. And done. Just like that, the springs are rigged too. As always, after every change, we do a quick test to make sure everything's working right. We don't really need these empties anymore, so why not just delete them? I hope you enjoyed this episode too. I'd really love to hear your thoughts and suggestions in the comments, and you can be sure we'll do our best to keep you satisfied. Okay, starting now, I'll be giving shoutouts to our Patreon supporters beginning the month after they join. That way, it doesn't matter if you join at the start or end of the month. you'll still get a full month of mentions in the videos. And for this month, a huge thank you to Eric Retania for the support. You're helping us keep these tutorials free for everyone, and we truly appreciate it. If you'd like to support what we're doing, you can join us at patreon.com/MiM_Repository. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.